In 2004, a group of Pakistani men brutally tortured and murdered a 15-year-old Scottish kid who was white. This became the first ever conviction for a racially motivated murder in Scotland. The full details of what these men did to Kriss Donald is horrific, and it's likely to be upsetting for you to listen to. However, it's important that these details are heard, and to note the tempered and reasoned response from the Scottish white community at the time. This is a community who are now, 20 years later, attacked by their own politicians who make self-aggrandising speeches in Parliament, berating the white population into guilted silence, claiming that there's some sort of deep-rooted and unconscious racism among white Scots, and that's holding back the non-whites from getting prestigious jobs in the country.
When the most senior positions in Scotland are filled almost exclusively by those who are white. The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white.
I will ask at the end of this, are white Scottish people racist? The leader of this group of men, Imran Shahid, had gotten into an altercation at a nightclub with members of a rival gang. The next day, with his ego bruised, Imran gathered his men and went out in a stolen car looking specifically for white people. The men had brought with them a collection of weapons including a hammer, screwdriver and knives. As they drove around, they found Kriss Donald and his friend Jamie Wallace. At first they tried to grab Jamie as they shouted, "White bastards!" But Jamie managed to wriggle free, and so they turned their attention to the younger and skinnier lad, Kriss. Kriss was heard to be shouting, "I'm only 15, what did I do?" as they bundled him into the back of the stolen car and began punching him. The torture would last for hours as they drove across the country and back. Kriss was stabbed at least 13 times before they poured petrol on him and set him on fire while he was still alive, leaving him to an agonising death. The Scotsman newspaper reported the final moments of Kriss's life as follows. The will to live was strong enough in Kriss Donald that he struggled up, staggered away from the tree trunk and tried to reach the grass slope that led to the walkway path. He died rolling in a muddy hollow in a futile attempt to extinguish the flames. In the days that followed, the police urged for calm as they tried to establish what the motive could possibly be. 3 of the men fled to Pakistan, but were later extradited back to Scotland. Chowdhury Mohammed Sarwar playing a key role in the extradition, and yes, he is the father of Anas Sarwar. At the time when this happened, I'm sure I praised the senior Sarwar for this. However, I'm now a little bit sceptical. I see this gesture more like a king sacrificing a few pawns in order to gain a greater advantage on the board. I'm ashamed to admit that I had almost forgotten about this incident until someone commenting on the last video reminded me. I was working down in England when this happened, and I recall there was quite a muted response from those in Scotland. Yes, they were upset and angry, but many people were very careful about saying too much out loud. There was no rioting or looting and burning down of buildings after this, and there was certainly no golden casket for the victim. After the first few days of reporting, the media started to drop the story. The BBC in particular have since been criticised for this as they limited the coverage and mostly kept it to regional news. The articles that were published would focus on a united message from police, politicians and the media calling for no one to react, even pushing the family to issue a statement asking for calm. The press did make sure to mention the BNP, the British National Party, as often as possible. This was a clear message to the masses. Yes, you may grieve, but don't be too loud, otherwise it is you who is the racist, and we will make sure that you are labelled as such. Years later, it was quietly acknowledged by authorities that there are plenty of racially motivated murders where whites are the victims. Yet we are still to this day lectured by people who say, you can't actually be racist towards white people, it's just not a thing. It doesn't work like that, it's just not possible. You can't be racist to white people. And of course, what that does is guilt people into silence. There have been other cases like that of Kriss Donald in the UK. The 2001 murder of Ross Parker in Peterborough, the BBC eventually admitting that they had underplayed its coverage of the Ross Parker case. Underplayed its coverage. This also reminds me of the Rotherham cover-up. This was a cover-up of sexual abuse, many of the victims being children, going back to the 90s, some say even the 80s, and it went up until 2013. The police and the authorities knew about it, and little was done. Thousands of victims, media silence, police inaction, government bureaucrats hiding their head in the sand for decades. Why? Because everyone was too afraid of being called racist due to the majority of the perpetrators being British Pakistani men. If we look at the Stephen Lawrence murder, a black man murdered by whites in 1993, which was just as disturbing and should be condemned, we see that the media did get behind this story and perhaps should be applauded, and that they are the ones that exposed the policing incompetence which then led to convictions, albeit many, many years later. Several mainstream TV dramatisations and documentaries were produced on the Stephen Lawrence murder, getting the story into the mind of the public. A new TV series was filmed as recently as 2021. Yet when I look at the Kriss Donald case, I can only find a single example from the mainstream, a one-off episode on Apple TV from last year. Why is this relevant? Well, it is incredible the power that the media hold. The news media, filmmakers, TV presenters, virtue signalling sports commentators, propagandists you might say. What they choose to cover in the news, TV shows, movies, shapes society and it influences opinion. I don't care how much you believe you're a free thinker, we're all shaped by the media to some extent. If the masses are told that the majority of white people are racist, then that's what they're going to believe. If the masses are not told about racist attacks on white people, then they will believe that there are no racist attacks on white people. If the masses are told by a non-white leader that they are to be shamed for the original sin of being born white, then the masses will embrace the self-hatred and leave themselves open to manipulation through the constant application of shame.
That 99% of the meetings I go to, I'm the only non-white person in the room.
Humza Yousaf claims that Scotland is a predominantly racist and intolerant nation simply because he happens to attend meetings that are attended mostly by white people. Mostly white people in Scotland? Are we a racist nation? Well, I guess that's going to depend on how you define racism. I've been all around the world, and depending on how you want to define it, you're going to find elements of racism in all cultures. Some of it harmless, some of it a little bit funny. Some of it is great for using as banter for breaking down barriers. If your definition of racism includes the fact that your granny still says that she's off down to the packy shop to pick up a pint of milk, then yeah, I guess we must all be dirty racists. However, if you live in a nation where someone of the predominant skin colour is kidnapped because of their colour by a minority group, they are then tortured and brutally murdered, and then the masses don't riot over it, and instead the masses keep inviting more minorities to come to the country, and eventually you allow an unelected member of that minority group to become the leader of the nation, then no, I don't think you can blanket call all of those people racists.